Alrighty, welcome all. This is Stella Aguilar, and we have Rex Morris, our very own master gardener. He's going to be speaking about pruning ornamental and fruit trees.
Today's talk is pruning ornamental and fruit trees. Now, we're going to give a sort of a pruning overview. And if you see the slide in front of you, myths of pruning, reasons to prune, a little bit about the biology, form and methods, deciduous plant materials, coniferous plant materials. So that's sort of the topics we're going to cover. Myths about pruning. I'm going to be reading through some of this stuff. Now, plants will die if pruned at the wrong time of the year. Okay? Now, a lot of people think that if you prune a plant other than when it's dormant, that it will die. Now, if you prune it at the wrong time, it may harm it a little bit, but in general, if it's a healthy plant, it's not going to die. All pruning must be done during the winter. Like I just said, when it's dormant, that's not necessarily true. Topping shade trees will keep the trees from causing damage to the home. Well, sometimes that's true, but a lot of times damage occurs to the home, okay, when it's not topped. For example, when it's too close to a foundation, the roots can actually pull up. They can actually do damage. I've seen examples where the roots have actually crushed gas pipes. They have broken water pipes and stuff like that. So, yes, trees can do damage if they're planted in the wrong spot. Removing a tree is a crime against nature.
Absolutely.
Well, I do happen to semi-agree with that. The problem is that too often people will plant a tree underneath power lines. That's wrong. They will plant a tree too close to the house so that the tree actually does start to do damage to the house. The branches get big enough that they start rubbing against the side of the house. I have seen branches of trees rubbing across shingles on the wind and actually tearing up shingles on a person's house. And like I said just a few moments ago, if it's too close to the house, sometimes when the roots go hunting for water, they'll pull up the foundation. So removing a tree is a crime against nature. That may be true, but that may be necessary because the tree was planted in the wrong spot to start with. Okay, most trees need pruning. Actually, mature trees seldom do, it says. Young trees usually benefit because pruning helps in establishing the base branch structure and in overcoming transplanting shock. Anyone with a pickup truck and a chainsaw is a qualified pruner. I've actually seen commercials on TV where a guy will come in and want to sit there and do pruning or some other maintenance on your house, and they'll pop a black plastic trash bag and say, I've been doing this for a whole 3 weeks. Well, yeah, they probably know almost nothing about how to really prune. All cut surfaces must be treated with tree paint. Now, that comment used to be very popular and done a few years ago. Nowadays, after lots and lots of actual physical testing, most of the time the trees will do just as fine if you don't paint over the cut branches as if you do paint over them. Nowadays, the only reason people will paint over a cut branch is appearances. In other words, if you've had to, for some reason, cut off a large branch, and you have a tree with a dark bark, and then you cut this branch off, and you see this white hole from a distance, it looks like, in the middle of your tree. Most people will then paint over it just so that color-wise it matches the color of the bark. But other than that, people no longer coat the cut branches or the cut areas off of the tree. Okay, reasons to prune. Now, the number one reason that you do prune is that first comment: remove dead, diseased, or broken branches. Now, that's pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you're removing a dead branch, who knows why it became dead to start with, but in case it was dead due to the second comment, disease, and you don't want the disease to spread, first thing you want to do is get rid of that branch. And generally, you want to remove dead branches, and then, like I said, diseased branches. Now, if you have a broken branch that's broken off, now, a lot of people don't or fail to remember is the cambium layer is the layer underneath the bark. That's the live layer of the tree. The wood in the center of the tree is no longer alive. If you break a branch, you're exposing more and more of the cambium layer, the live layer, to air and insects, and you're increasing the possibility, because you have a larger exposed area, that insects could get in there and transmit a disease to the branch. So, you probably want to remove dead, diseased, or broken branches right away. Okay, and then the second reason is to remove undesirable growth. Now, by undesirable growth, we're talking about, like I said earlier, parts of the tree that are interfering with the house, for example, or some other structure. Maybe a branch is getting into a fence of some sort, but there are lots of reasons why you want to remove undesirable growth. Now, we'll talk a little bit more, and by undesirable growth, sometimes the undesirable growth is an errant branch of the tree, which is going off at an angle that is unusual and hitting other branches of the tree. And if you have one branch of the tree rubbing against another branch of the tree, there again, you're rubbing off the bark and you're exposing the both branches to live tissue that are going to be more susceptible to insect damage and insect infestation and viruses and stuff like that. So undesirable growth is branches that are at odd angles in the tree, as well as branches that are hitting foundations, house, fences, stuff like that. And in some cases, undesirable growth is if you did plant the tree in the wrong spot, it's hitting a highline wire. So there's lots of reasons. Okay, maintain or reduce plant size. You have I should back up and say maintain or reduce plant size. I hadn't really thought about it, but I did go online, and typically if you go to a nursery and you buy a tree and you look at the tag and it gives you the expected size of a tree, it turns out that most of the time when the expected size of a tree listed on the tag is not the true ultimate size of the tree, it's the size of the tree after something like 7 to 10 years. So after 7 to 10 years, a lot of trees might grow another third or half more than what it said on the tag. So if you really want to know before you plant a tree where to put it, don't look at the tag, go online and get the ultimate size of that tree. That way, if you plant it in the correct location, you don't have to worry about maintaining or reducing tree size. Okay. Now, the fourth reason is stimulate flowering and fruiting. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about stimulating fruiting. Now, as far as stimulating flowering, you know, there's a lot of trees have flowers that are very colorful. And if you, well, we'll go a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay. Another reason for pruning is rejuvenating and restoring old plants to vigorous growth. If you have an old plant, if you have an old tree, short tree, big shrub that's gotten out of hand, sometimes if you cut them way back, you actually encourage new growth and get some of the vigor of the plant back. Okay. So that's another reason to prune. Okay, and then we've already mentioned damage to life or property. I suppose when you talk about damage to life, you're talking about pruning something bad, pruning something back and getting so heavy that it doesn't fall on somebody. Okay, and then the last reason is shaping plants into an artificial form. Now, I've seen people take and shape certain trees into animal shapes and stuff like that. That's all personal preference. Okay, now before you actually start the pruning process, you want to have the proper tools. Obviously, shown here, I'm going to start on the right first. Pruning shears, depending on how strong you are, you know, you probably use shears to cut something off up to about what, half, possibly 3/4 of an inch thick. Loppers from, let's say, 3/4 of an inch to maybe 1.5 inches. And then if it's anything beyond that, you probably will want to use a pruning saw. Now, I just pulled pictures of these things off of the internet, but there are, you know, everybody has their own personal preference on those particular tools. Okay, so these are just examples, and everybody has their own favorite shape of loppers, shears, everything else that they want to use. So it's not really important. That's all personal preference on what kind of tools you want to use. Next slide. But the important thing to remember is that any of those tools that you use, before you start using them, they should be sharp. So if you have a tool that's been around for a long time, you haven't used it in a long time, first thing you want to do is obviously knock off the rust and sharpen it so that the blade is very sharp. And then next you want to sterilize it so that if you're cutting more than one branch, one tree, that kind of stuff, if you're cutting off a dead branch and it does happen to be diseased, then you don't want to sit there and transmit that disease to the next tree that you're trying to lop off. So you want to be sure and sterilize them beforehand. Now, going back to making sure that your tools are very sharp, I have seen people take a dull pruner and try and snip off a small branch, and it's so dull that it ends up smashing the branch to the point where it's almost looks like it's been chewed on rather than cut. So all you're doing there is, like I said, you're tearing apart the surface and exposing the cambium there underneath, and you're going to have the potential for more disease to be spread. So it's very, very important that you can maintain sharp tools. Okay, now just as a repeat, times to prune for specific pruning. You want to prune the broken, diseased, or dead branches when you first observe them. No reason to wait. You want to get rid of them right away. Okay? And the next one is, like I said earlier, prune out of place branches which are interfering against or rubbing against other branches. Now those, when I say those, the out of place branches are the branches that are growing at such an odd angle, they're starting to or about to rub with other branches that are on that tree. That's what I mean by pruning out of place branches. And you want to prune those right away as well before they start rubbing other branches. Next slide. Okay. Time of the pruning is based on the flowering, fruiting, or growth habits of the tree, its tendency to bleed, and the fact that pruning usually stimulates a flush of regrowth. When to prune trees with showy flowers. Flowering trees can be pruned during the dormant season for many of the same reasons you prune less showy trees. Still, to preserve the current year's flower crop, prune according to the following schedule. Now, what that means there is the next statement: trees that flower in the early spring, redbud, dogwood, other trees. I'm not an expert on various kinds of trees, but if your tree flowers early in the season, then the best time to prune off the flower areas is right after the early tree bloomers, flower buds appear on new growth the following year. Okay, so you prune them immediately after they flower, whenever that is. Now, commenting there, many flowering trees are susceptible to fire blight, okay, bacterial disease. These trees should be pruned during the dormant season. If they're susceptible, I would set it, I'm not an expert on diseases, but if you're in a particular location and you have a tree and you've heard about a particular disease going around to that tree, then instead of pruning them after they flowered, you would want to go ahead and wait for the dormant season. Only because obviously in the dormant, now the diseases, bacterial diseases, the bacteria doesn't fly, from one tree to the next. The bacteria, the viruses, are spread by insects, chewing on one tree and then carrying that bug, that virus, to another tree. By pruning during the dormant season, that's when your insect problems are going to be lowest. So that's primarily the reason for pruning during the dormant season, if there's any concern about diseases going around for a particular tree. Okay, trees that flower in the summer or fall should always be pruned during the dormant season. Okay, now there, if you correctly prune it, flower buds will form on new twigs during the next growing season, and the flowers will bloom normally. Now, let's try the next slide. I'm not sure if I put that. Okay. When to prune trees without showing flowers. Now, when I say bleeding, and you're asking about bleeding, all I'm saying is the fact that anytime you cut a large branch off, okay, there's going to be sap oozing out of the wound. So during the dormant season, during the cold season, now, when we're talking about conifers, okay, evergreens, they don't actually go completely dormant during the cold season, but even though they don't go dormant, the sap flow will be less during the winter than it was during the summer. Going very fast. Okay, Conifers may be pruned any time of year to raise the footing of the plant, but pruning during the dormant season may minimize sap and resin flow from the cut branches. Now, when I make the comment on conifers about raising the footing of the plant, okay, I'm talking about if you have branches which are low to the ground and you're going to be putting something underneath there, you're going to be, maybe even parking a car underneath there or something like that, and you want to raise the lower branches, then the best time to do it would be during the winter time. Not actually the dormant season, but during the winter time. And you would cut the lower branches off, okay, after the primary leader, next to the primary leader that's coming up. Now, so because the thing you want to be careful of, a lot of times, depending on how shrubby the conifer is, if you're going to cut off at the bottom, okay, just to see which branches, okay, are at the bottom, you got to be careful because some of the higher branches, they droop down. Now, the higher branches that you don't necessarily want to cut droop down a little bit, okay, and you start cutting the ends of the branches so you see what you have. One thing you have to realize about conifers is once you cut off the greenery of the conifer, it's gone. It will never come back. That is the tip of that branch that you cut the greenery off of will never get any greenery back. So if you're cutting the bottom branches, you want to be sure that it might be better to raise up the greenery so you can physically look underneath the bottom of the tree to see which branches are actually at the bottom of the leader and cut those off to raise it up. Now, the next statement, you should not top the leader of the conifer. Now, when we talk about conifer, we're talking mostly about evergreens. Now, if you stop and think about the shape of evergreen trees, they'll sort of have a conical type shape. Now, evergreen trees, if you, for some reason, you want to cut off the top of an evergreen tree is actually, when you stop and think about it, it's just like a lot of other trees. If you cut off the top of it, of an evergreen, the top of the leader, the simple leader of the evergreen, it'll generally die back to the first branch that's going out at an angle. And what will happen is the first branch, or maybe even the first couple of branches that are below where you cut the leader off, they'll become the leader. So what will happen is, if you're not careful, you have what started out like a nice conical shape, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, the leader got cut off. It died back to the first two branches, and this branch is pointing that way, and the other branch is pointing this way. And what happens is you no longer have a conical shape. Those two branches will become leaders. They'll go off at the side. So you're going to have what looks like a nice cone. Then all of a sudden you have these wings coming out, so that the tree looks ridiculous. Okay, the next part down there. If you trim a conifer of old growth, such the underlying branches are exposed, so you want to trim back a conifer, and you start cutting the area on the outside, and you cut too far, and you see bare branches underneath, that hole, if you will, the non-green area will always be there. Okay, will not eventually green up. It's gone. If you want to maintain the width of an evergreen, then you have to sit there and cut off the new growth. New growth will occur in late spring, very early summer on conifers, evergreens. Now, depending on some of the new growth might look like long, narrow shoots, little fingers coming up. It might look like little brushes but the main thing is, if you look at the old growth behind it, and then you see something that looks dramatically different on the ends tips of the branches, then that stuff on the branches that looks different than the underlying green is the new growth. And if you want to keep your evergreen from getting any wider, then you can cut off the new growth and maintain the width of the evergreen. Hardwood trees without showy flowers need to be pruned in the dormant season to more easily see the structure of the tree. To maximize wound closure in the growing season after pruning, to reduce the chance of transmitting disease, and to discourage excessive sap flow from wounds. Okay? Recent wounds and the chemical scents they emit can actually attract insects that spread tree disease. So those are all reasons for, if you can, to trim during when they're dormant and in the winter time. Okay, so that's the times to prune. So now we're going to talk about actually pruning a tree. Now this slide right here, it's hard to visualize. Now for those of us who are here, okay, there's, they can't see it when I'm using this, but where the branch comes off and the branch is away from the swelled part. So you have a larger branch, and then you have a smaller branch coming off of that. And then in your picture, there's something they call the branch collar. Now, the branch bark ridge may be very noticeable. It may not be very noticeable, but the branch collar will usually be a slightly thicker portion that sticks out an inch or two from the base of a larger branch. So you want to cut a branch, if you're removing that branch, beyond the branch collar. Go ahead, next slide. Okay. The basic cut, 3-point cut, heading back, thinning, renewal. Those are techniques. Heading back only means you're cutting off a branch before it meets another branch, and you are cutting off going back to a node where a bud is. Okay, if you're you got a branch and it's starting to grow into a direction where you don't want, but you don't want to cut off the branch completely back where it meets another major branch, you might want to cut it off just beyond a bud. You would like to look at the bud, find out which way it is pointing, so that when that bud starts to grow with a new branch, it's going in the direction that you want. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, thinning is when you generally, in thinning, that's when you actually remove a branch back to where it's meeting another branch. So basically, heading back is making little snippets off of a tree. Thinning is when you cut back to another branch. Renewal is, like we said earlier, generally reserved for old plants that have lost their, seems like their luster, their dynamic growth, and you want to try and get them restarted by stimulating them to produce new growth right near where the main trunk is. So the only real difference between those is the amount that you're cutting off of the branch. But anyway, now these pictures, this really applies more to a large branch. Now, one of the things that you need to worry about, if you're cutting off a large branch is that you don't strip the bark off of the branch that you're having to remove. And in this example, where the first deal where it says make a shallow cut on the underside of the branch, about 4 or 5 inches from the trunk. So that is what he's doing. He's cutting about halfway through the branch. And then in picture number 2, he is cutting another 2 or 3 inches out on the limb beyond where he made the underside cut. And then he cuts down far enough, the branch comes off. Now, you don't have to worry about that if you're making a cut with loppers, if you're making a cut with the shears. Okay, you are going to be cutting stuff that's small in weight. But if you're having to cut it with a pruning saw, like is shown in this slide right here, then the branch is going to be heavy enough that if you made the cut, that it might break off and tear part of the bark off as it breaks and falls down. Now, this is an extreme example of, now this branch that you see broken off, okay, wasn't being cut, but it did break off, and I'll show this slide later on and explain why it broke off. And you can see as it broke off, it peeled the bark off the side of another branch. And that's definitely what you do not want to have happen. So the reason for cutting it the way it was cut in the previous slide is to prevent something like that from happening. So another slide showing the branch collar. And then you want to prune to minimize the area of the wound. So you can see where on the second picture where they cut it off perpendicular. Now, if they were to cut it so that it was not perpendicular, more at an angle, all you're doing when you cut it other than perpendicular to the line of the branch, okay, you're exposing more of the cambium layer to, you're cutting it, the cambium layer that's exposed is larger. So if the area is larger, the potential for bugs to get in there and spread disease is greater. So that's the main reason for cutting it like it's cut in this picture on this, or like it's cut in the second picture. Okay, and here's an example of a properly cut branch. And then they're showing you that after a year, if it's properly cut, it'll generally heal just fine. A problem that occurs is with co-dominant stems. You can see in this picture that the area between the two branches, which are about the same size, doesn't have a nice, between the two, doesn't have a nice, I would call it a saddle between the two branches. And if you look at there where it says, on the left picture where it says stem bark ridge, if you'll notice, there is sort of a line, that stem bark ridge is a line where the bark from one branch is coming up against the bark from another branch, and the two halves of bark are sort of pushing against each other, and they've created that ridge. And if you saw in the second, on the other one, you'll see a stem bark ridge in two that are coming off, well, three branches that are, too close to each other. There's no saddle between the two branches. So those areas like that with the stem bark ridge are weaker. They're not as strong. They have a potential to break more easily. Now here, there's the ridge between the two. There is no stem bark ridge between those two, but you'll notice that a couple of smaller branches have started in that same area where those two branches come together. If those branches are allowed, the smaller branches are allowed to grow, then they will actually create a stem bark ridge, which will weaken the whole joint area, the whole structure. So if you see something like that starting, you definitely want to get rid of those branches because you don't want multiple branches in general at the same spot on the tree.
Excuse me,
Now,
Rex, question. The one with no saddle, in training many years ago, they said that, one had to eventually become dominant. So are you saying that I can just keep them with no saddle as long as I don't have some extraneous growing and they're not going to be as strong, but they'll still be okay?
No.
Like the palo verdes,
No,
they seem to do that a lot.
the answer is no.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I guess these slides probably aren't in the best location. If you'll notice on this picture right here, they have on the slide or on the picture on the left, that branch was removed too far from the collar area, and it started to die back. Well, as it starts to die back, okay, it starts dying back, and it exposes the whole tree to more possible damage. Now, on the right-hand side, okay, it shows a branch which is, or where it was cut, was a little bit more. There, I probably, personally, would have actually cut it just a little bit further out than that, but that's the general idea. Now, a lot of people will talk about cutting, like on the left picture, they'll cut it well beyond the branch collar. And a lot of times, especially if you've seen trees where they've just whacked off the tops of it, if the power company comes along and a tree is starting to interfere with a power line, the power company doesn't want that tree touching their power lines. So the power company comes along with a chainsaw and then they just cut it off at the top. They're not concerned about the looks of the tree. They just want it away from the power lines. So they don't make correct cuts. And then quite often you'll see what are called water spouts or water sprouts that are sticking up where a branch was cut off, not near the branch collar, and it started trying to grow little sprigs off of where the cut is, and they look horrible. And those water sprouts, okay, will start to grow. They're not really very strong. The potential for them to break is very easy, and they just plain old look ugly. So that's another reason you really want to cut them off. Now, backing up, I have seen them, cut a branch off well beyond the branch collar area, and it forms the water sprouts. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you cut a branch off near the branch collar, that it won't form water sprouts. But what will happen is the potential is there if you get water sprouts near the branch collar, but it is much, much, much more likely to get water sprouts if you've cut it well away from the branch collar. Okay, now here we're talking about on the left, if you are cutting off a branch, not at a branch collar, and an example on the left, you're cutting a branch off between two buds. That's not the correct place to cut that branch. You want to cut the branch off just above a bud. Now, if you actually, the angle doesn't look very good there, but they recommend when you cut a branch off like it's being cut there, that you cut it off at about a 45-degree angle. Okay. Now, if you cut off at a 45-degree angle, then moisture is less likely to pool at the end of the cut. And where you have moisture, theoretically, you could have the potential for more insect infestation at that spot. You'll notice that down there at the bottom, the branches are about the same size. Okay. Ideally, if they're about the same size and they have included bark, theoretically, you really should cut one of them off. So the joint will always be weaker. Okay. So the best solution is to cut one of them off like that. In this case, on the left-hand side, they've got a more of a U shape. So this on the left-hand side could have been, if it's if it's a large shrub, you could have had a multi-limbed tree there if you wanted. In this case, they went ahead and cut off. Looks like the right branch was cut off, and not only did they do that, they trimmed a lot of the branches that were lower on the branch that remained. You can see that they took off a lot of those branches there. They're trying to specifically turn that shrub into a small tree, okay, a one-trunked tree, and ultimately they want the branches to be fairly high. So you can have a multi-trunked small tree, but don't expect it to get too tall. If you take and cut off one branch like that, then you can plan on making that one branch, make it a slightly taller tree than with a multi-branch system. The multiple branches coming off with the same spot like that are inherently, okay, less secure. They're more likely to break. Okay. And then on the right-hand side, where you can see and down the center that included bark right there, that is very likely to split. Now, for that reason, when this one on the right was small, they should have cut one of those off, but obviously they did not. Now, if you happen to have, you buy a home, for whatever reason, the tree wasn't correctly pruned and the tree has gotten larger, then it's big like that, the danger of splitting down the center of the two branches is higher, but you want to keep the tree. Then The only thing that you can do after you let it get so big, okay, on the left-hand side there, it shows where a potential split could occur. And about all you can do if you want to try and keep the tree from splitting is actually putting a cable across there. Now, a lot of people say, well, you're drilling a hole in there and you're putting an anchor into, let's see, people that are here in the audience, you're putting an anchor in there, and they say, well, you're damaging your tree if you drill a hole in there and put that anchor in there. Well, yeah, the actual living tissue is the cambium layer. So when you're drilling through there, yes, you're destroying a little circle about like this of the cambium layer. But the wood that's in the interior of the branch is dead wood anyway. So you drill a small hole, put your anchor there, then you're really not destroying too much of the living tissue that's part of the tree. Okay. Now, if for whatever reason somebody made a circle around the bark, around the entire outside of the tree, and dug in a little bit and exposed the cambium all around, that's a lot of damage, and you're likely going to end up with a dead trunk there. But drilling a small hole and putting a hook in there is not really going to hurt the tree. Now, cabling it like it's shown in the picture, and down there at the bottom where it talks about races, they've actually taken a rod, a steel rod, and gone all the way through both branches and put a solid steel rod on either side and bolted it to try and keep them. In addition to cabling like that, obviously, after you've cabled it, you really want to prune it heavily on both sides. The idea is the fact that even with the cabling, there is a potential for the tree to separate. And just to help reduce the potential for breaking, you will want to do a lot of pruning to keep the weight on both sides down so that it's less likely. You know, you have two trunks. You increase the weight on each side. The weight wants to split apart the two trunks where they join together. So in addition to cabling, play it safe, you'll want to heavily, if you want to keep that tree, you'll want to heavily prune it continuously. Of course, the only other solution is to take, even if it's old, if it's been around for a long time, is to sit there and cut off one of the trunks altogether. So here's just some more examples of wrong way to cut. So it says wrong, wrong, and then right. So there's 3 examples there of poorly cut branches. And then the last one is if you're cutting off the branch the correct way to cut it off. And here's an example again. This is the same picture that I showed you earlier where they had trunks that didn't have a good saddle on it. And one branch actually got heavy enough, it tore off and then damaged the whole tree by tearing off a big hump of the bark, exposing the cambium layer below it. So anything you do, you want to prevent something like that. Crown raising is nothing more than removing the bottom branches, like we were talking about for the conifers. It's too close to a walkway and the branches are sticking out at the walkway. You want to remove the lower branches. You're putting a bench underneath there. You want to remove the lower branches. You want to drive a car underneath there. You remove the lower branches. So crown raising is just removing the lower branches so that there's more space underneath the tree. crown thinning, it might be difficult. Here they're showing we talked about earlier, here is a picture in A where there's a strong union, and a picture B where there's a poor union, and you see a lot of included bark there. So they're showing the same thing there. So there they're saying in this picture that if you are looking at branches to remove, you're thinning out it so that it's, for whatever reason, you want to thin out some of the branches, and you would want to look at areas where you have a pore, like a B, a spot where you have two of the branches and you're thinking about, okay, do I want to remove these or do I want to thin these out? Then for sure, if you're thinning out branches, you would want to thin out a B location where the branches are actually starting to have included bark. You want to take one of those off if you're going to be thinning out branches. Now, obviously, if you're thinning out branches and you don't have any included bark, like in the B picture, then it's just your discretion whether you want to use it or not. Now, crown reduction, they're showing a picture there of a tree that physically got too close to power lines. So instead of whacking it off like the power company would do right across the top, you go back there and actually start removing those high branches, at least removing them where two branches come together rather than whacking it across the top. Now, that never looks good for a tree. And going back to our original statements, that's the last thing you want to do, but you might be forced to do it. The better option would have been to put that tree where it belonged rather than underneath a power line. Pruning techniques that will cause a tree harm: topping a tree, tipping a tree, bark ripping, flesh cutting, and then stub cutting. So there, topping a tree, like we said just a moment ago, is bad for a tree because it just doesn't look right in general. And you can see at the top of that tree where they just topped it by cutting right across the top and rounding it off without cutting it where two branches came together, and it's formed a lot of water sprouts that we're talking about. And then tipping, same thing, it formed a lot of water sprouts when they did the same thing there. And then bark ripping is an example of cutting it without undercutting it first, and the weight of the branch ripping some of the bark off. Flesh cutting is where they cut straight down on the branch when they were taking it off, rather than cutting it perpendicular to the line of the branch they were removing. So they were cutting it straight down, so it just makes for, when the tree heals, it looks worse. Stub cutting is where they cut it just a little bit too far out and it formed little leaves. So here's an example of thinning limbs back to the main trunk. Here's an example of pinching out growing tips or shoots. Now, these would be more common on this right-hand side where they're pinching that out there. I would probably reserve doing that for conifers most of the time, pitching off the new growth if you don't want it to get any wider. I suppose you could do that. I personally wouldn't do that. Now, here's just a repeat on the right-hand side. If you'll see where they did thin out the trees, they cut the branches that they thinned out back to where the other branches joined it. So they were thinning the tree and they cut off the branches to thin it out, cutting back to where another main branch joined it rather than, so that's probably more of the correct way to thin. Down here at the bottom, if you did take off a branch, not going back to the big branches, okay, they're showing on the left side where they took it off, and they're making a comment, if you cut here, the remaining stub will die. So you should, on the right-hand picture, they're showing where it should have been cut so that you don't have an ugly dying stem coming off there. And then on there, on the right-hand set of pictures, they're showing it cut at a 45-degree angle, and then the correct location to cut the branch if you're cutting off just above a bud, which will eventually pop out and form another branch. The correct location. One is too far from the bud, one is too close to the bud, and one is correctly cut at the bud. Now, we've talked about pruning pruning conifers and pruning regular or ornamental trees. Now we're going to talk about pruning fruit trees. Now, if you have a fruit tree and you want to use it as an ornamental tree, then there's nothing wrong with that. You would just sit there and you treat it like we've been talking about for any tree. You might want to thin it out. Now, another reason I forgot to mention that you might want to thin a tree out is the only good reason. It's different for fruit trees, but for an ornamental tree, the only reason why you might want to thin out the branches on an ornamental tree is if you end up right in the interior of the tree, you end up with some of the leaves never getting any sunlight whatsoever. Okay, then those leaves that never get any sunlight, eventually the potential for insect infestation becomes higher. So the ideal situation is to have all the leaves get at least some sunlight during the day. So that's basically the only real practical reason for thinning out an ornamental tree. Now, on fruit trees, on the other hand, I should back up and say, okay, now the idea behind fruit trees altogether is the way photosynthesis works. Everybody knows about that. The sunlight strikes the leaves through photosynthesis makes starches and sugars, which are then carried to the rest of the tree for the tree to grow. If it's a fruit tree, those starches and sugars that are made by the leaves, some of that starches and sugars end up in the fruit. Now, from a philosophical point of view, if you have a nice big tree, but at any one time, only half of the leaves are getting sunlight, but all of the branches are producing fruit, then what you're doing is taking the starches and sugars that are created in half of the leaves that are getting sunlight, when you're spreading those starches and sugars to all of the fruit. Now, a lot of people don't bother to trim their fruit trees. What they'll do is take every other piece of fruit when it first starts, they'll just pluck it off so that the remaining fruit, okay, gets a little bit more starches and sugar, so it makes for a better piece of fruit, a sweeter piece of fruit, that kind of stuff. However, if you do it that way, the tree will have used at least some of the energy into getting those pieces of fruit started that you pluck off. So the better solution is in general to prune a fruit tree so that all of the leaves get the maximum amount of sun. That way, the fruit will be at its best. Okay, with that in mind, if you look at the example where on these pruning fruit trees, where they have, where it says correct and incorrect, incorrect, they've taken the tree was received from the nursery, and there's a branch 1, 2, then A, B, and C. And they took, surprisingly, they took branch 1 and 2, and then they kept B and took out A and C, and actually it looks like they took out another one. And then 1 year later, what was the leader in picture B, or the leader in the second picture, it sprouted 2 more branches. And then in the last picture of the top, after the leader sprouted 2 branches, they cut off the leader. So if you look at, now it's hard to see, but if you look at the picture on the right, on the top, those branches are approximately, now not perfectly, they are approximately, if you look straight down, they're about 90 degrees apart from each other. So ideally, what you would like to have is 3 or 4 branches. Now, if you have 4 branches, ideally, you want the branches to be about 90 degrees apart, coming out in the ordinal directions. If you have 3 branches, you would want them to be about 120 degrees apart and have 3 branches equal distance from each other all around. And then for fruit trees, after they've got the scaffold branches they want started like that, they take out the center leader. What happens if you keep the center leader in, it continues to grow up. It continues to make more branches, which can have more leaves, which shade the leaves that are lower. So if you're pruning a fruit tree for maximizing your fruit, after you get 3 to 4 scaffold branches started, then you would take out the center leader to prevent more branches from growing up, or more branches from getting up higher and shielding the lower branches. So that's the ideal concept for fruit trees. Now here's an example. I'm kind of surprised how this guy did it, but he's got 4 branches that look amazingly about 90 degrees apart from each other. And then if there was a center leader, it's hard to even tell, because this tree obviously is old enough that it's been around for a few years, but he's done a very good job of pruning it so that the branches, picking the branches so that they're fairly well separated from each other. Same thing, here's another picture before pruning and after pruning. Now this is also a tree that's been around for some time. There again, after they've properly established the scaffold branches, those are the lower 3 or 4 branches we're talking about, and he's taken out the center leader so that there's not more growing on top. On the before pruning side, this tree will have been, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years old. Obviously, all this was done in the winter time after when the tree was dormant. And we were talking earlier about a good time for a lot of trees to prune them is in the wintertime after they've lost their leaves. It's easy to look at it and see what needs to be done. And then they've actually thinned it out, some of the branches, so that some of the branches that were on top of each other, real close to each other, so that one branch, the leaves on one branch would have been shielding the other. So they removed some of they thinned it out a little bit so that the branches were a little bit better separated, so that it was more likely that the branches, once they developed their leaves, the leaves would all have sunlight. So that's another example. Now here they actually, we're talking about trimming a tree that you recently planted way back. Here they took a tree, a new tree, and they pruned it way back. And then after the first summer, they had some nice branches and they pruned those back. The lower ones, you'll see down there where it says the lower two of the lower branches were pruned back to the trunk. There again, the only reason for prune that I can think of for prune, some people will prune the lowest branches down because it depends on the kind of fruit tree you have. If the branches are too low to the ground, then you'll end up with the trees producing, or the lowest branches producing fruit, but then the fruit will weigh the branch down to the point where it's too low to the ground and it's going to be touching the ground, or it's going to be, animals are going to easily get to it, that kind of stuff. So this person, you know, everybody has a different philosophy. A lot of people will say, well, I want my fruit trees to be well off, the branches to be well off the ground, but I don't want them so high that I have to use a ladder to get to them. So a lot of that pruning the fruit trees is personal philosophy and what the person wants to have in the way of their trees. Here's an example where they ended up with branches, and the branches that were real close in, they took those out, and they had three nice branches, which are craft scaffold branches, which are well separated from each other. Another sample of a whole bunch of fruit trees that have 3 or 4 branches. Safety rules: call for a professional for large trees or for jobs you don't have the equipment for. If, you know, most people around here aren't handy with chainsaws. So if it's branches big enough that you need to use the chainsaw, you probably need to call in a professional to take care of it. Keep all equipment sharp and in good repair. Use equipment only for the job it was designed for. Be conscious of electric lines when pruning. Okay, if a power line is touching a tree limb, call the power company. Never climb a tree without a safety rope or with a chainsaw, because you're going to sit there and hurt yourself. Keep your fingers clear when using hand pruners. Use care in handling pruned limbs and brush to avoid ivy. So those are the safety rules you want to follow. That's it.
Thank you.